In the hushed corridors of Westminster Hall, where centuries of history have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, 8 young souls stand frozen in time. Their shoulders bear not just the weight of ceremonial swords and ancient traditions, but the crushing reality that the woman who taught them to ride horses, bake scones, and find strength and duty will never again call them by the pet names only she knew. As millions of eyes watch through television screens and smartphone cameras, these grandchildren of Queen Elizabeth II prepare to honor her in the most public and intimate way possible, standing guard over her coffin in a vigil that will strip away all royal protocol and reveal the raw, unfiltered grief of a family saying goodbye to their beloved grandmother. This is not just the story of a constitutional monarchy mourning its longest reigning sovereign. This is the story of Prince William fighting back tears while remembering bedtime stories at Balmoral. This is Princess and children struggling to maintain composure while recalling summer picnics where their grandmother insisted on washing dishes herself. This is Prince Harry, thousands of miles from the life he once knew, returning to stand beside the brother with whom he once shared everything, united only by their shared loss and the solemn duty that transcends all personal pain. In 15 minutes, they will take their positions around the oak coffin draped in the royal standard. In 15 minutes, the world will witness something unprecedented in modern royal history. But right now, in these final moments before the vigil begins, they're simply grandchildren, scared, heartbroken, and desperately trying to honor a woman who was both the most public figure in the world and the most private treasure of their hearts. The morning of September 17th, 2022, dawned gray and heavy over London, as if the very sky understood the solemnity of what was to come. Inside Clarence House, Prince William sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the military uniform laid out before him. The scarlet tunic of the Welsh Guards seemed to mock him with its pristine condition, every brass button polished to perfection by hands that had served his family for generations. But no amount of tradition could prepare him for what he was about to do. Catherine found him there, 20 minutes before they were due to leave for Westminster Hall. His hands were steady, but she could see the tremor in his jaw, the way his eyes kept drifting to the photograph on his nightstand. The Queen with Prince George, both of them laughing at some private joke during last Christmas at Sandringham. The image had been taken just 8 months ago, but it felt like a lifetime. She always said we were her anchors, William whispered, his voice barely audible. Catherine sat beside him, her hand finding his. When everything else changed, when the world shifted around her, she said her grandchildren kept her grounded. How can I be anyone's anchor when I feel like I'm drowning? The question hung in the air between them, unanswered because there was no answer. How do you prepare a man to stand vigil over the coffin of the woman who taught him what it meant to serve? How do you comfort someone who has just lost not only his grandmother, but the living embodiment of everything he was raised to become? Across London, in her modest apartment near Hyde Park, Zara Tyndall was facing her own impossible morning. The woman who had represented Great Britain in the Olympics, who had faced down 1,000-pound horses at full gallop without flinching, found herself unable to stop her hand from shaking as she tried to fasten the buttons of her naval uniform. Her husband Mike watched helplessly as she struggled with a simple task that should have been automatic. "Mummy would laugh at me," Zara said suddenly, tears finally spilling over. She'd say I'm making a fuss over nothing. She never made a fuss about anything, not even when Grandpapa died. She just carried on, because that's what you do. That's what she taught all of us. But I don't know how to carry on without her. Mike wrapped his arms around his wife, feeling the weight of her grief settle against his chest. Zara had always been the most down-to-earth of the royal grandchildren, the one who eschewed titles and insisted on making her own way in the world. But even her fierce independence couldn't shield her from this loss. The Queen hadn't just been her grandmother. She had been her role model, her compass, her safe harbor in a world that often felt hostile to anyone connected to the crown. The memories came in waves now, each one more painful than the last. Zara remembered being 7 years old and falling off her pony during a riding lesson at Balmoral. She had scraped her knee badly and was trying not to cry when the Queen appeared beside her, kneeling in the mud without regard for her spotless cream coat. "Tears are not weakness, darling," she had said, producing a handkerchief embroidered with her initials. They're just love with nowhere to go. But we must always get back on the horse. Now, 15 years after the Queen's death, Zara realized that this vigil wasn't just about honoring her grandmother's memory. It was about getting back on the horse one last time, together, at Frogmore Cottage. The morning had taken on an almost surreal quality for Prince Harry. He stood in front of the mirror in what had once been his bedroom, adjusting the cross-belt of his blues and royal's uniform. The house felt empty without Meghan and the children who had remained in California, but he understood their absence. This was something he needed to do alone, as a grandson, as a member of the family he had chosen to leave, but could never truly abandon. The flight from Los Angeles had given him 12 hours to think, to remember, to grieve. He had spent most of it staring out the window at the endless ocean below, wondering what his grandmother would say about the choices he had made, the bridges he had burned, the pain he had caused. The Queen had never been one for dramatic confrontations or emotional scenes, but Harry knew she had been hurt by his departure from royal life, hurt by the accusations and revelations that had spilled out in interviews and books. But she had never stopped loving him. Even in the darkest days of the royal family's crisis, when his relationship with his father and brother had deteriorated beyond repair, she had continued to send birthday cards, to ask about her great-grandchildren, to remind him that he would always have a place at her table. The last conversation they had shared, just 2 months before her death, had been about Archie's fascination with airplanes and Lilibet's first steps. She had listened to every detail with the kind of attention she usually reserved for matters of state, because to her, family was a matter of state. The irony wasn't lost on him that he would be standing vigil alongside William, the brother with whom he hadn't spoken properly in over 2 years. The brother who had once been his closest friend, his confidant, his partner in the complicated dance of royal duty. The brother who now felt like a stranger wearing a familiar face. Harry checked his watch and realized it was time to leave. As he walked through the rooms of Frogmore Cottage, he found himself remembering another vigil, 25 years earlier, when he and William had walked behind their mother's coffin through the streets of London. He had been 12 years old then, drowning in a grief too large for his small body to contain, but the Queen had been there afterward, steady and strong and determined to help them heal. She had never tried to replace their mother, but she had made sure they knew they weren't alone. Now she was gone too, and the boy who had once found comfort in her presence was a man of 37, estranged from his family and struggling to find his way back to them through the maze of hurt and misunderstanding that separated them. But for these few hours, none of that would matter. For these few hours, they would simply be her grandchildren, united in their love for her and their determination to honor her memory. Meanwhile, Peter Phillips was driving through the gates of Buckingham Palace in silence, his sister Zara beside him. As the children of Princess, and they had grown up slightly outside the direct line of succession, which had afforded them a different kind of relationship with their grandmother. She had been less formal with them, more relaxed, more willing to let her guard down and simply be a grandmother rather than a sovereign. Peter remembered Sunday lunches at Windsor Castle, when the Queen would insist on serving the vegetables herself, piling extra Yorkshire pudding on his plate despite his protests that he was trying to watch his weight. "Nonsense," she would say, "you're too thin, and it's not feeding you properly." It had become a running joke between them, this gentle teasing about his appetite. But underneath, it was something deeper, the simple joy of a grandmother fussing over her grandson. "Do you remember the Christmas she taught us to play charades?" Zara asked suddenly, breaking the silence in the car. Peter smiled despite his grief. It had been 1995, and the royal family had been going through one of their most difficult periods. The Queen, perhaps sensing the tension, had announced after Christmas dinner that they would all play charades, and no one was allowed to refuse. She had assigned herself to Peter's team and had proceeded to act out Gone with the Wind with such theatrical flair that even the most sullen teenagers had been reduced to helpless laughter. She was terrible at it, Peter said, his voice thick with emotion. Absolutely dreadful. But she didn't care. She just wanted us all to be together, to remember that we were a family before we were anything else. That had been the Queen's gift, her special magic, the ability to create moments of normalcy in the midst of extraordinary circumstances. She had understood better than anyone that her grandchildren needed to be children sometimes, not just members of the royal family. She had given them that freedom, that space to simply exist without the weight of duty and expectation pressing down on them. Now, as they approached Westminster Hall, both Peter and Zara felt the full weight of that duty settling on their shoulders. They were no longer the carefree children who had played charades with their grandmother. They were adults, parents themselves, carrying forward the legacy she had entrusted to them. Lady Louise Windsor sat in the back of the car with her brother James, Earl of Wessex, watching London pass by through rain-streaked windows. At 18 and 14 respectively, they were the youngest of the Queen's grandchildren, and their grief was complicated by their youth and the fact that their relationship with their grandmother had been perhaps the most normal of all. The Queen had been a constant presence in their lives, not as a distant figurehead, but as an active, engaged grandmother who attended their school plays and remembered their friends' names. She had taught Louise to drive in the grounds of Balmoral, patiently enduring the jerky starts and sudden stops of a nervous teenager learning to operate a Land Rover. She had listened to James's detailed explanations of his latest video game conquests with the same attention she gave to briefings from the Prime Minister. "I don't know how to do this," Louise whispered to her brother. At 18, she was on the cusp of adulthood, about to start university, eager to step out into the world and make her own mark. But the thought of doing so without her grandmother's guidance, without those Sunday phone calls where the Queen would ask about her studies and offer gentle advice, felt overwhelming. James, despite being younger, had always been protective of his sister. "We do it together," he said simply, "the way she taught us. We look after each other, and we remember everything she taught us about duty and service and love." The words sounded older than his 14 years, and Louise realized that their grandmother's death had forced them both to grow up in ways they weren't prepared for. But perhaps that was part of her legacy too. The understanding that life doesn't wait for you to be ready, that sometimes you have to find strength you didn't know you possessed and carry on because carrying on is what's required. As their car pulled up to Westminster Hall, Louise could see the crowds of people lining the streets, people who had traveled from all over the world to pay their respects to the Queen. Some were crying, some were singing hymns, some were simply standing in respectful silence. All of them were there because they had loved her too, in their own way, from their own distance. It struck Louise then that this vigil wasn't just for the family. It was for everyone who had found comfort in the Queen's steady presence, everyone who had drawn strength from her example, everyone who had felt, even for a moment, that they were part of something larger and more enduring than themselves. In standing guard over her grandmother's coffin, Louise and her cousins would be representing not just their own grief, but the grief of a nation, a commonwealth, a world that had lost someone irreplaceable. The cars came to a stop outside Westminster Hall, and for a moment, none of the grandchildren moved. This was it, the moment they had been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. In a few minutes, they would take their places around their grandmother's coffin and stand vigil in front of millions of watching eyes. They would do it with dignity and grace because that's what she had taught them. They would do it together because that's what family means. And they would do it with love because love was the foundation of everything she had given them. As they stepped out of their cars into the gray London morning, each of them carried their own memories, their own pain, their own hope that they could honor her legacy in this final act of service. The vigil was about to begin, and with it, their first steps into a world without the woman who had been the North Star of their lives. The weight of crown and heart had never felt heavier, but they would bear it together, as she had taught them to bear all things, with courage, with grace, and with an unshakable belief in the power of duty and love to carry them through even the darkest hours. Westminster Hall stood like a cathedral of history in the heart of London, its ancient stones bearing witness to over 9 centuries of British monarchy. Built in 1097, the hall had seen the trials of kings and the celebrations of queens, but never had it held such profound significance for a generation of young royals who were about to transform from grieving grandchildren into symbols of continuity for a nation in mourning. The oak coffin of Queen Elizabeth II lay in the center of the hall, draped in the royal standard and topped with the imperial state crown, the orb, and the scepter. The jewelry caught the light from the television cameras positioned at respectful distances. But to the grandchildren gathering in the preparation room adjacent to the hall, these were not symbols of power. They were simply the accessories their grandmother had worn to countless state occasions, familiar objects that now felt impossibly heavy with finality. Prince William stood at the window of the preparation room, watching the endless queue of mourners stretching along the south bank of the Thames. He had been told that people had been waiting for over 14 hours just for the chance to spend a few seconds beside his grandmother's coffin, to pay their respects to the woman who had been a constant in their lives for over 70 years. The sight should have been comforting, this outpouring of love and respect, but instead it made him feel more isolated than ever. "Your Royal Highness?" The equerry's voice was gentle, but insistent. "It's time." William nodded, but didn't move immediately. He was thinking about a conversation he'd had with his grandmother just 6 months earlier, during her final Christmas at Sandringham. She had been friendlier then, though she tried to hide it behind her usual brisk efficiency and dry humor. They had been walking through the gardens when she'd suddenly stopped and taken his arm. "When the time comes," she had said, her voice steady but her grip surprisingly tight, "remember that the crown is just a hat. What matters is the head that wears it and the heart that guides it. Never let them convince you that duty and love are incompatible. They're the same thing, seen from different angles." At the time, he had nodded and assured her that such thoughts were premature, that she would be with them for many years to come. But she had given him one of her knowing looks, the expression that had always made him feel as though she could see directly into his soul. "Promise me," she had insisted. "Promise me you'll remember that being royal doesn't mean being perfect. It means being present, being willing to carry the burden so others don't have to." Now, as he prepared to take his place beside her coffin, those words echoed in his mind with new urgency. The burden was his now, in ways both literal and symbolic. As the heir apparent, he would one day wear the crown that currently rested on her coffin. But more immediately, he had to find a way to be present for his family, for his country, for all the people who looked to the royal family for stability and continuity in times of crisis. Harry appeared at his elbow, similarly dressed in military uniform, but carrying himself with a tension that spoke of internal conflict. The brothers hadn't spoken privately since their arrival in London, their interactions limited to the necessary coordination for the various ceremonies and obligations that had filled the days since the Queen's death. The silence between them was heavy with years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding, but for the moment, their shared grief created a fragile truce. "She would have hated this," Harry said quietly, gesturing toward the cameras and the elaborate protocol surrounding every moment of their mourning. All the fuss and ceremony. She always preferred the quiet moments. William considered this, remembering his grandmother's discomfort with grand gestures and public displays of emotion. But he also remembered her deep understanding of the role that ceremony and ritual played in helping people process collective grief and loss. She understood the difference between what she wanted and what was needed, he replied. "This isn't for her. It's for them." He nodded toward the crowds visible through the window. The comment hung between them, carrying implications neither was quite ready to address. Harry had spent the last several years arguing that the royal family gave too much of itself to public expectations, that the cost of constantly prioritizing duty over personal happiness was too high. William had remained committed to the institution, even when that commitment had required painful sacrifices and difficult choices. Their grandmother's death had not resolved this fundamental disagreement, but it had temporarily suspended it in favor of a shared purpose. Zara and Peter arrived together, both looking composed but pale. As the children of Princess, and they had grown up with a different relationship to royal protocol, less formal, more pragmatic, but no less committed to the family and its traditions. Zara's eyes were red-rimmed but dry. She had done her crying in private and was now focused on the task ahead. "Mum sends her love," she told William and Harry. princess and was participating in other aspects of the funeral preparations and would not be part of the grandchildren's vigil, but her presence was felt nonetheless. She had been the queen's only daughter, the child who had perhaps understood her mother's sense of duty most completely, and she had raised her own children to understand that love and service were inseparable concepts. Peter nodded to his cousins with the kind of understated solidarity that characterized their family's approach to emotional expression. He had always been the most private of the grandchildren, avoiding the spotlight and building a career outside the royal sphere, but his love for his grandmother was no less profound for being quietly expressed. As the eldest grandchild, he felt a particular responsibility to help guide his younger cousins through this unprecedented situation. "She's proud of you," he said simply, addressing all of them, but looking particularly at Harry. "Whatever else has happened, whatever disagreements there have been, she's proud of all of you. She told me so the last time I saw her." The words carried weight because Peter was not given to emotional speeches or empty reassurances. If he said the queen had expressed pride in her grandchildren, it was because she had done so explicitly and with her characteristic directness. For Harry, who had spent the last several years wondering whether his grandmother had forgiven him for the pain his choices had caused the family, the statement was both a gift and a challenge. Lady Louise and James arrived with their parents, the Earl and Countess of Wessex. At 18 and 14, they're the youngest participants in the vigil, and their youth seemed to highlight the enormity of what was being asked of all the grandchildren. Louise moved with the careful grace of someone trying to appear older and more composed than she felt, while James maintained the quiet dignity that had characterized his public appearances throughout his short life. The Earl of Wessex, Prince Edward, looked at his nephews and his children with an expression of mixed pride and concern. As the Queen's youngest child, he had perhaps had the closest relationship with her in her later years, and he understood better than most how much she had valued her role as grandmother. She had often spoken to him about her hopes for the grandchildren, her concerns about the pressures they faced, her determination to give them as normal a childhood as possible despite the extraordinary circumstances of their birth. "She wanted you to know," Edward said to the assembled group, "that she was never prouder of this family than she was in these last few years. Seeing all of you grow into the people you've become, watching you find your own paths while still honoring your heritage, it gave her great joy." The statement was carefully worded, acknowledging both the traditional paths chosen by William and Kate and the more unconventional choices made by Harry and Meghan. It was a reminder that the Queen's love for her grandchildren had never been conditional on their adherence to royal protocol, that she had valued their happiness and authenticity as much as their service to the crown. The Countess of Wessex, Sophie, had perhaps been closer to the Queen than any of her daughters-in-law. She had filled some of the emotional space left by Diana's death, becoming a confidant and companion to the older woman while also serving as a bridge between generations within the family. Now she looked at the grandchildren with maternal concern, understanding that they were about to undertake one of the most emotionally challenging experiences of their lives while being watched by billions of people around the world. "Remember," she said gently, "you don't have to carry this alone." She taught all of us that we're stronger together, that the family is always bigger than any individual member. Lean on each other when you need to. She would want that. The advice was practical and emotional at once, reflecting the Queen's own approach to family relationships. She had always emphasized the importance of mutual support and collective responsibility, even when individual family members were struggling with personal conflicts or disagreements. The vigil would require them to put aside their differences and function as a unit, just as she had taught them to do throughout their lives. As they prepared to leave the preparation room and enter Westminster Hall, each of the grandchildren was lost in their own thoughts and memories. The weight of the moment was almost overwhelming. The knowledge that this would be their final act of service to their grandmother, their last chance to honor her before she was laid to rest beside Prince Philip in the small chapel at Windsor Castle. The protocol for the vigil had been carefully choreographed, but within that structure, each grandchild would have to find their own way of saying goodbye. Some would focus on standing perfectly still, maintaining the military bearing that their training had instilled. Others might allow their minds to wander through decades of shared memories, using the quiet time to process their grief and celebrate their grandmother's life. All of them would be aware of the cameras, the watching crowd, the historical significance of the moment, but they would also be aware of something more personal and immediate, the simple fact that they were about to stand beside someone they loved for the last time. The doors to Westminster Hall opened, and a hush fell over the assembled mourners. The grandchildren formed a small procession, walking with measured steps across the ancient stones toward the coffin that held their grandmother's remains. The cameras captured every movement, every expression, every gesture, but they could not capture the weight of emotion that each young person carried or the depth of love that motivated their service. As they took their positions around the coffin, William and Harry at the head and foot, the others flanking the sides, they became part of something larger than themselves. They were no longer simply individuals grieving a personal loss. They had become symbols of continuity, representatives of a tradition that would outlive them all, embodiments of the values their grandmother had spent her life defending and promoting. The vigil began in absolute silence, broken only by the soft sounds of distant traffic and the occasional whisper from the watching crowds. Each grandchild stood at attention, their eyes focused straight ahead, their thoughts turned inward toward memories that would sustain them through the difficult minutes ahead. They were surrounded by history, by tradition, by the weight of centuries of royal protocol. But in that moment, they were simply grandchildren honoring the woman who had loved them unconditionally and taught them everything they knew about duty, service, and the complicated relationship between public obligation and private affection. The shadows of Westminster Hall seemed to embrace them, offering protection and solitude even in the midst of such public scrutiny. Here, in this ancient space that had witnessed so much history, they could finally begin the process of saying goodbye to the Queen while honoring the grandmother, finding a way to balance their personal grief with their public responsibilities, just as she had taught them to do in every other aspect of their lives. The silence in Westminster Hall was profound, a living thing that seemed to pulse with the collective breath of thousands of mourners who had fallen completely still as the Queen's grandchildren took their positions around her coffin. The only sounds were the distant hum of London traffic, the occasional creak of ancient timber, and the soft whisper of fabric as people shifted position in the long queue that snaked through the hall. But for the 8 young people standing at attention around the oak casket, the silence was filled with memories, conversations, and the echo of a voice that had guided them through every significant moment of their lives. Prince William stood at the head of the coffin, his eyes fixed on a point just above the heads of the mourners filing past. His military training had taught him to remain perfectly still during ceremonial duties, but nothing could have prepared him for the emotional complexity of this particular vigil. Every few minutes, a face in the crowd would catch his attention. An elderly woman dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, a young father lifting his daughter so she could see over the barriers, a veteran in a wheelchair saluting with tears streaming down his cheeks. These were the people his grandmother had served for 7 decades, the people she had worried about during economic crises and celebrated with during moments of national triumph. She had often spoken to William about the weight of their expectations, the responsibility of carrying their hopes and fears, the delicate balance between being a symbol and being human. "They don't need you to be perfect," she had told him once, during a particularly difficult period when media criticism had been especially harsh. "They need you to be present. They need to know that someone is paying attention, that someone cares about their struggles and their joys." Standing there now, William felt the full weight of that responsibility settling on his shoulders. These people hadn't come to Westminster Hall just to pay respects to a monarch. They had come to say goodbye to someone who had been a constant in their lives, a figure of stability and continuity in an increasingly uncertain world. In a few years, when his own time came to serve as king, he would need to be that same constant for a new generation. The thought was simultaneously terrifying and humbling. At the foot of the coffin, Prince Harry stood with his own complex mix of emotions swirling through his consciousness. He had spent the last several years questioning the value of royal tradition, arguing that the personal cost of public service was too high, but the institution demanded too much of individuals in exchange for its support. But, standing here, surrounded by the tangible evidence of his grandmother's impact on ordinary people's lives, he found himself reconsidering some of his more absolute positions. A young mother passed by the coffin, her toddler son sleeping peacefully in her arms despite the crowds and cameras. She paused for a moment longer than most, her lips moving silently in what might have been a prayer or simply a whispered thank you. Harry remembered his grandmother holding him in much the same way when he was small, remembered the security and warmth of her embrace during the darkest days after his mother's death. She had never tried to replace Diana, but she had made sure he knew he was loved, that he belonged, that his pain mattered. The irony wasn't lost on him that his decision to step away from royal duties had been motivated by a desire to protect his own children from the pressures he had experienced growing up in the spotlight. Yet here were thousands of people whose lives had been touched, however distantly, by his grandmother's willingness to accept those same pressures for the sake of something larger than herself. The contradiction wasn't comfortable, but Harry was beginning to understand that most important truths contained such contradictions. Peter Phillips stood along the side of the coffin, his expression composed, but his mind racing through decades of Sunday lunch conversations with his grandmother. As the eldest grandchild and the son of princess, and he had perhaps had the most unfiltered access to the Queen's thoughts and opinions. She had been more relaxed with him, more willing to express frustration with political developments or amusement at media speculation about the family's private life. He remembered one particular conversation, about 5 years earlier, when she had expressed concern about the increasing polarization of British society and the growing challenges facing democratic institutions around the world. The monarchy survives because it adapts, she had said, cutting her roast beef with characteristic precision. But it can only adapt if each generation understands both what must be preserved and what must be allowed to change. That's your job, all of you, to figure out how to carry forward what matters while letting go of what doesn't. Looking around Westminster Hall now, Peter could see evidence of that adaptive process in action. The ceremony itself was ancient, rooted in traditions that stretched back centuries, but it was also being broadcast live on social media platforms that hadn't existed when their grandmother's own father had lain in state. Young people in the crowd were taking selfies while also maintaining respectful silence, finding their own ways to participate in this ritual of national mourning. The monarchy was evolving even as it honored its past, just as she had always said it must. Zara Tyndall stood across from her brother, fighting to maintain the military posture she had learned during her brief service in the Royal Navy. As an Olympic athlete, she was accustomed to performing under pressure, to maintaining focus and composure when millions of eyes were watching. But this was different from any competition she had ever faced. The stakes weren't personal achievement or national pride. They were something deeper and more complex, something that touched on her understanding of family, duty, and the relationship between individual identity and collective responsibility. Her grandmother had always been supportive of Zara's athletic career, attending competitions whenever possible and celebrating victories with genuine enthusiasm. But she had also used those experiences to teach lessons about resilience, preparation, and the importance of gracious behavior in both triumph and defeat. The horses don't care about your title, the Queen had said after Zara's first major victory. They only care about your competence and your character. That's a useful thing to remember in all aspects of life. Now Zara found herself applying those lessons to the most challenging performance of her life. The mourners filing past represented not just British citizens, but people from around the Commonwealth and beyond, many of whom had traveled thousands of miles to be present for this moment. They deserved her best effort, her most respectful attention, her commitment to honoring both her grandmother's memory and their own need to grieve and remember. Lady Louise Windsor, at 18 the youngest female participant in the vigil, was acutely aware of the cameras but trying not to let that awareness affect her posture or expression. She had grown up in an unusual position within the royal family, close enough to the center to understand its importance, but far enough from the direct line of succession to maintain some degree of privacy and normalcy. Her grandmother had been instrumental in creating that balance, ensuring that Louise and her brother James could experience both the privileges and the responsibilities of royal life without being overwhelmed by either. The Queen had particularly enjoyed Louise's thoughtful questions about history, politics, and the role of constitutional monarchy in modern democracy. During their regular phone conversations, she had often asked Louise about her studies, her thoughts on current events, her plans for university, and beyond. These conversations had been among the Queen's greatest pleasures in her final years. The opportunity to engage with a young mind that was curious about the world but not yet burdened by the full weight of public expectation. Standing in Westminster Hall now, Louise felt the profound responsibility of representing not just her own grief, but the hopes and dreams her grandmother had invested in the younger generation of the royal family. The mourners passing by included many people her own age, young adults who were just beginning their own journeys into adulthood. Their presence reminded her that the monarchy's relevance would ultimately be determined by her generation's ability to connect with and serve people who might have very different experiences and expectations than previous generations. James, Earl of Wessex, was fighting his own internal battle against the enormity of the situation. At 14, he was old enough to understand the historical significance of the vigil, but young enough to feel overwhelmed by the attention and expectation. His grandmother had always treated him with a kind of gentle respect she reserved for people she believed had great potential, listening seriously to his observations about video games, school life, and teenage social dynamics. She had particularly enjoyed his stories about ordinary teenage experiences, difficulties with homework, friendship drama, his struggles to understand girls his own age. These conversations had reminded her of the importance of maintaining perspective, of remembering that behind all the ceremony and protocol were real people dealing with universal human challenges. Kings and commoners all face the same basic problems, she had told him once. We just have to face them in front of cameras. Now, standing beside her coffin while those cameras recorded every moment, James was beginning to understand what she had meant. The grief he felt was the same emotion experienced by anyone who had lost someone they loved. The difference was that his grieving had become a public act, a symbol of the nation's collective mourning. It was a heavy responsibility for someone so young, but he drew strength from remembering her confidence in his ability to handle whatever challenges life might present. The crowd continued to file past, each person taking a moment to pause, to reflect, to pay their respects in their own way. Some crossed themselves, some bowed their heads, some simply stood quietly for a few seconds before moving on. The diversity of the mourners was striking. People of all ages, ethnicities, and social backgrounds united in their desire to honor the Queen's memory. Many were clearly tourists who had traveled specifically for this moment, but others appeared to be local residents who had simply felt compelled to join this unprecedented expression of collective grief. Among the mourners, the grandchildren occasionally glimpsed faces that seemed familiar, distant relatives, family friends, people who had worked for the royal household over the years. These recognizable figures served as anchors in the sea of strangers, reminders that while this vigil was a public ceremony, it was also a deeply personal farewell to someone who had been at the center of their lives for as long as they could remember. The physical demands of standing at attention for an extended period were beginning to be felt, but none of the grandchildren showed any sign of discomfort or fatigue. Their military training, their years of participating in royal ceremonies, their understanding of what this moment meant to the watching world, all of these factors combined to keep them focused and composed. But beneath the surface discipline, each was engaged in their own private conversation with their grandmother's memory, their own process of saying goodbye, while simultaneously committing to carry forward the values and principles she had embodied. The silence continued to hold, profound and sacred, broken only by the soft sounds of respectful movement and the occasional whispered prayer or expression of sympathy from the crowd. In this silence, the grandchildren found something they had been seeking since the moment of their grandmother's death, a sense of connection not just to her memory, but to the larger purpose she had served, the continuity she had represented, the hope she had invested in their generation's ability to meet the challenges of an uncertain future. This was more than a vigil. It was a form of communion, a shared experience of love, loss, and commitment that transcended the boundaries between individual and collective grief. In standing guard over their grandmother's coffin, the Queen's grandchildren were participating in something both ancient and immediate, both personal and universal. They were saying goodbye, but they were also saying hello to the responsibilities they would inherit, to the people they would serve, to the future they would help to create in her memory, and according to her example. As the vigil entered its second hour, the grandchildren had settled into a rhythm of remembrance that transcended the physical discomfort of their positions. Each had found their own way to navigate the complexity of public mourning while processing their private grief. The steady stream of mourners continued, but for the young royals, the individual faces had begun to blur into a collective representation of a love and respect their grandmother had earned over 7 decades of service. Prince William found his thoughts drifting to conversations he'd had with his grandmother about the future of the monarchy. She had been surprisingly frank about the challenges facing the institution, acknowledging that each generation would need to find new ways to remain relevant while preserving essential traditions. The crown is not about personal glory, she had told him during one of their regular weekly dinners at Windsor Castle. It's about service to something larger than yourself. But service without understanding is meaningless. You must know the people you serve, not just as subjects, but as individuals with their own hopes and struggles. Those words carried new weight as William watched the procession of mourners. Each person represented a life that his grandmother had touched, however, indirectly. The elderly veteran who stood straighter as he passed the coffin, the young teacher who wiped away tears while thinking of the Queen's visits to her school, the immigrant family whose British citizenship ceremony had included the Queen's photograph. All of them were part of the vast tapestry of human experience that the monarchy was meant to serve and represent. The irony wasn't lost on William that he was learning one of his most important lessons about kingship while saying goodbye to the woman who had taught him everything else about royal duty. The vigil itself was a masterclass in the balance between personal emotion and public responsibility. He was allowed to grieve, but his grief had to be controlled, dignified, suitable for public consumption. He was expected to show strength, while also demonstrating that the loss was meaningful to him personally. It was a delicate balance that his grandmother had perfected over decades of public appearances during both triumphant and tragic moments. Across the coffin, Prince Harry was engaged in his own complex internal dialogue about duty, family, and the choices that had led him to this moment. The past several years have been marked by his increasing frustration with the constraints of royal life, his growing conviction that the personal costs of public service were too high for him and his family to bear. But standing here, surrounded by evidence of his grandmother's extraordinary impact on ordinary people's lives, he found himself questioning some of his earlier certainties. A young woman passed the coffin carrying a small bouquet of flowers, her movement careful and reverent. She reminded Harry of his wife Meghan, and he felt a sharp pang of regret that his grandmother would never see his children grow up, would never have the chance to develop the kind of close relationship with Archie and Lilibet that she had enjoyed with William's children. The choices that had brought his family security and privacy had also created distance from the woman who had been the most constant source of love and stability in his life. But Harry also remembered his grandmother's words during their last private conversation, just days before his final departure from royal duties. "I want you to be happy," she had said simply. "Whatever that requires, whatever choices you need to make, I want you to find peace and happiness. But remember that you will always be my grandson, and you will always have a place in this family." The statement had been both a blessing and a burden, freeing him to pursue his own path while reminding him that some bonds transcend geography and institutional affiliation. Now, participating in this final act of service to her memory, Harry felt the truth of those words in a new way. His relationship with the monarchy might be complicated, his future role uncertain, but his love for his grandmother and his commitment to honoring her legacy remained unambiguous. The vigil was his way of saying thank you for her love, her understanding, her willingness to let him find his own way even when that way led away from everything she had devoted her life to preserving. Peter Phillips was thinking about the last letter his grandmother had written to him, received just 2 weeks before her death. It had been a typical communication from her, brief, practical, focused on family news and gentle inquiries about his work and his daughters. But reading it now, in retrospect, he could see traces of a woman who knew her time was limited and was taking care to express her love for each member of the family in her own understated way. The girls are growing up so beautifully, she had written about his daughters, Savannah and Isla. I hope you're finding time to simply enjoy them, not just worry about their education and their future. Childhood passes so quickly, and the moments of pure joy become precious memories that sustain us through difficult times. Make sure they know how much they are loved, not just by you, but by all of us. The advice was typically practical, but also deeply personal, reflecting the Queen's understanding that the most important gift she could give her grandchildren was the security of unconditional love. Peter had grown up with that security, had taken it for granted in the way that children do, but he understood now how rare and precious such consistent affection really was. His grandmother had created a space within the royal family where being loved didn't depend on perfect behavior or adherence to protocol, where mistakes were forgiven and individuality was celebrated. Zara was remembering her wedding day and the speech her grandmother had given at the private family reception. It had been uncharacteristically personal and emotional, a departure from her usual public speaking style. "When I watch you with Mike," the Queen had said, "I see the same look in your eyes that I had when I married your grandfather. It's the look of someone who has found their anchor, their safe harbor in an uncertain world. Hold on to that, protect it, never take it for granted." The advice had seemed almost quaint at the time. Zara and Mike were young, confident, certain of their ability to weather whatever challenges life might present. But now, standing in Westminster Hall, while saying goodbye to the woman who had been her own anchor for 31 years, Zara understood the deeper wisdom in her grandmother's words. Love was indeed a harbor, but it was also something that required constant tending and protection. The Queen had protected her love for Prince Philip through decades of public scrutiny and personal challenge, just as she had protected her love for her children and grandchildren. The vigil was itself an act of love, a public declaration that the bonds of family transcended death and institutional obligation. Each of the grandchildren was there not because protocol demanded it, but because love required it. They were honoring not just a monarch, but a grandmother, not just a public figure, but the woman who had shaped their understanding of duty, service, and the complicated relationship between personal happiness and collective responsibility. Lady Louise was thinking about the last Christmas at Sandringham, the final time all the grandchildren had been together with their grandmother. Louise had been struck by how frail the Queen had seemed, how carefully she had moved, how quickly she had tired during what had traditionally been her favorite family celebration. But she had also been impressed by her grandmother's determination to maintain family traditions, to ensure that everyone felt included and valued despite the obvious effort required. After Christmas dinner, when most of the family had dispersed to various activities, Louise had found herself alone with the Queen in the drawing room. They had sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire and listening to the distant sounds of her cousins playing games in another room. "This is what I'll miss most," the Queen had said suddenly. "Not the state banquets or the constitutional meetings, but these quiet moments with the people I love most." The comment had surprised Louise, who had always assumed that her grandmother's greatest satisfactions came from her public duties and historic achievements. But in that moment, she glimpsed something deeper, a woman who had spent her entire adult life in service to others, but who found her greatest joy in the simple pleasure of being surrounded by family. The vigil was a continuation of that same dynamic, a way of bringing the family together around their grandmother one last time, even in death. James was struggling more than the others with the physical demands of standing at attention for such an extended period, but his discomfort was overwhelmed by his sense of privilege of being included in such an important moment. At 14, he was the youngest participant, and he felt acutely aware of the trust that had been placed in him to represent the family with dignity and composure. His grandmother had always treated him as an adult, even when he was very young, engaging him in serious conversations about current events and asking for his opinions on everything from environmental policy to technological innovation. She had been genuinely interested in his perspective as a member of the first generation to grow up entirely in the digital age, often asking him to explain social media trends or new forms of online communication. "You see the world differently than we do," she had told him during one of their conversations. "That's not a criticism, it's a gift. The monarchy survives because each generation brings new insights and new ways of connecting with people. Your job, when your time comes, will be to help us understand how to serve people whose lives are very different from anything we've experienced." Standing in Westminster Hall now, surrounded by people of all ages who had come to pay their respects, James felt the weight of that responsibility. The mourners included many people his own age, teenagers, and young adults who might view the monarchy as an outdated institution irrelevant to their own lives. His challenge, and that of his generation of royals, would be to prove that service and duty could still have meaning in an age of rapid change and increasing individualism. The crowd continued its slow procession past the coffin, and occasionally someone would pause longer than the protocol typically allowed, overcome by emotion or lost in personal memories of how the Queen had touched their lives. The security personnel were gentle but firm in keeping the line moving, understanding that this moment needed to be shared by as many people as possible. But these brief pauses served as reminders that each person in the crowd had their own relationship with the Queen's memory, their own reasons for making the journey to Westminster Hall. Among the mourners, the grandchildren occasionally spotted familiar faces, household staff who had served their grandmother for decades, distant relatives who had traveled from across the Commonwealth, family friends who had shared holidays and celebrations over the years. These recognizable figures created moments of connection and warmth within the formal ceremony, reminders that while this was a public event, it was also deeply personal farewell to someone who had been the center of their extended family's life. The candles in Westminster Hall flickered gently, creating shifting shadows that seemed to dance around the ancient stones. The light was both dramatic and intimate, appropriate for a ceremony that straddled the boundary between public pageantry and private grief. Each grandchild was aware of the cameras recording their every movement, but they were also aware of something more immediate and personal: the presence of their grandmother's memory, the weight of her expectations, the comfort of her continuing love. As the vigil continued, each of them found their own way of saying goodbye, while simultaneously recommitting to the values she had taught them. They were not just mourning a death, they were celebrating a life, honoring a legacy, and accepting the responsibility to carry forward the best of what she had represented. The silence in Westminster Hall was profound, but it was also full of promise. The promise that love endures, that service matters, that the bonds of family can sustain individuals through even the most difficult challenges. In standing guard over their grandmother's coffin, the Queen's grandchildren were participating in something both ancient and immediate, both personal and universal. They were saying goodbye, but they were also saying hello to the responsibilities they would inherit, to the people they would serve, to the future they would help create in her memory and according to her example. The vigil was ending, but the real work of honoring her legacy was just beginning. As the vigil approached its conclusion, the atmosphere in Westminster Hall seemed to shift subtly, as if the ancient stones themselves understood that this moment of communion between past and future was drawing to a close. The grandchildren had been standing at their posts for nearly 15 minutes, but the time had felt both eternal and impossibly brief. Each had found their own way to navigate the complex emotions of the moment, their own method of honoring both their private grief and their public responsibility. The final group of mourners to pass during the vigil included a remarkable cross-section of British society and the broader Commonwealth. Elderly couples who remembered the Queen's coronation moved slowly but determinedly past the coffin, their faces etched with the kind of deep sadness that comes from losing someone who has been a constant throughout one's entire adult life. Young families lifted small children to see over the barriers, creating memories that would last a lifetime and ensuring that even the youngest generation could participate in this historic farewell. Prince William found himself making eye contact with a small girl, perhaps 5 years old, who was being held by her grandfather. The child waved solemnly, as if she understood that something momentous was happening even if she couldn't fully comprehend its significance. William felt a sudden, overwhelming connection to this unknown child, seeing in her the future that his grandmother had spent her entire reign trying to protect and improve. The realization struck him that the vigil wasn't just about honoring the past, but about accepting responsibility for the future, about promising to serve the next generation with the same dedication and love that the Queen had shown to his. The weight of inheritance settled on William's shoulders in that moment. Not just the literal inheritance of titles and responsibilities, but the emotional inheritance of being responsible for maintaining the values and standards that his grandmother had embodied. The crown would come to him eventually, but more immediately, the duty to represent the family's commitment to service would pass to his generation. The vigil was his formal acceptance of that role, his public commitment to continuing the work that the Queen had begun. Prince Harry, standing at the opposite end of the coffin, was engaged in his own complex process of accepting inheritance and responsibility. His path would be different from William's, less defined by constitutional obligation, but no less meaningful in its commitment to service and impact. The lessons their grandmother had taught them about duty and love weren't dependent on holding royal titles or living within the formal structure of the monarchy. They were universal principles that could guide any life committed to making the world better. As he watched the mourners pass, Harry found himself thinking about his children in California, about the bedtime stories he would tell them about their great-grandmother, about the ways he could honor her memory while building a different kind of life. The Queen had always emphasized that the most important service happened not in grand public gestures, but in small, daily acts of kindness and responsibility. He could serve her memory by being a good father, a supportive husband, a thoughtful contributor to the causes he cared about, regardless of whether those contributions happened within or outside the formal structure of royal duty. Peter Phillips was remembering a conversation with his grandmother about the nature of legacy and how individuals could best honor the memory of those they had lost. It had taken place during the period following Prince Philip's death, when the Queen was grappling with her own questions about how to carry forward the work they had shared for so many decades. The best way to honor someone's memory, she had told him, is to live in a way that would make them proud, not to try to become them or to replicate their choices, but to apply the principles they taught you to the circumstances of your own life. Philip wouldn't want me to stop working or to spend my time in constant mourning. He would want me to continue serving, to find joy where I can, to take care of the people and institutions we both loved. Now, as Peter prepared to say his final goodbye to his grandmother, he understood that the same logic applied to honoring her memory. She wouldn't want her grandchildren to be paralyzed by grief or to feel that their own choices were limited by her example. She would want them to take the love and wisdom she had given them and apply it to their own unique circumstances, their own opportunities to serve and contribute and make a difference in the world. Zara found herself thinking about her daughters, about the stories she would tell them about their great-grandmother, about the ways she could pass on the Queen's values and principles to the next generation. The vigil had reinforced her understanding that the most meaningful service often happened in private moments, in the daily work of raising children with integrity and compassion, in the simple act of being present for the people who mattered most. Her grandmother had always been present for her family, despite the enormous demands of her public role. She had attended school plays and sporting events, remembered birthdays and anniversaries, created space for individual relationships within a larger context of royal obligation. Zara realized that her own way of honoring the Queen's memory would be to provide the same kind of steady, loving presence for her own children, to create the same sense of security and unconditional love that had sustained her through her own childhood and adolescence. Lady Louise was beginning to understand that the vigil marked not just an ending, but a beginning for her own relationship with royal duty and public service. At 18, she was on the cusp of making decisions about her education, her career, her role within the family that would shape the rest of her life. Her grandmother's death had accelerated that process, forcing her to consider questions about service and responsibility that she might otherwise have postponed for several more years. The mourners passing the coffin included many people Louise's age, young adults who were dealing with their own questions about purpose and direction. Their presence reminded her that her generation of royals would need to find new ways to connect with and serve people whose lives and experiences might be very different from her own. The challenge would be to maintain the traditional values of duty and service while finding fresh ways to express those values in a rapidly changing world. James, despite his youth, had perhaps the clearest understanding of what the vigil meant for his future. As the youngest grandchild, he would have the longest time to put his grandmother's lessons into practice, the most opportunities to honor her memory through his own choices and actions. The responsibility was daunting, but also exciting, the chance to carry forward something precious and important while also making it his own. The final moments of the vigil approached, and each grandchild felt the weight of transition settling over them. They were about to step back into their individual roles within the family and the broader world, but they would carry with them the memory of these 15 minutes of shared purpose and collective commitment. The silence had been sacred, but it was also preparation for the conversations and decisions that would follow. As the time came to step away from the coffin, none of the grandchildren moved immediately. There was something profound about breaking the formation they had held, about ending this final act of service to their grandmother. But gradually, with the careful choreography that had marked every aspect of the funeral proceedings, they began to withdraw, each taking a last moment to look at the coffin that held someone who had been the center of their lives for as long as they could remember. The mourners who remained in Westminster Hall watched this transition with deep respect and understanding. They had witnessed something extraordinary, not just a ceremony or a ritual, but a genuine expression of love and commitment that transcended the boundaries between public and private, between individual and collective, between past and future. The grandchildren had given them a gift by sharing this moment of vulnerability and dedication, by allowing their private grief to become part of the nation's collective mourning. As they walked away from the coffin, each grandchild carried with them not just memories of their grandmother, but a renewed understanding of their own responsibilities and opportunities. The vigil had been an ending, but it was also a beginning, the start of their individual and collective efforts to honor her memory through lives of service, dedication, and love. The Queen's physical presence was gone, but her influence would continue through the choices her grandchildren made, the values they upheld, the ways they chose to serve others and contribute to the common good. The vigil had been their promise to her and to themselves that her legacy would live on, not as a burden or obligation, but as a source of strength and guidance for whatever challenges lay ahead. Outside Westminster Hall, London continued its daily rhythm, but something had shifted in the relationship between the royal family and the people they served. The vigil had demonstrated that duty and love were not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of the same commitment to something larger than individual interest. The grandchildren had shown that it was possible to be both genuinely human and appropriately royal, to express authentic emotion while maintaining public dignity, to honor tradition while remaining relevant to contemporary concerns. As they reunited with their parents and spouses, as they prepared for the final farewell that would take place at the funeral the following day, each grandchild knew that they had participated in something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They had said goodbye to their grandmother in the most public and meaningful way possible, surrounded by the love and respect of millions of people who had shared their grief and their commitment to honoring her extraordinary life. The vigil was over, but the real work was just beginning. The work of carrying forward her example, of serving with the same dedication and grace she had shown for 7 decades, of proving that the values she had embodied could still guide and inspire people in an uncertain and rapidly changing world. It was work that would last the rest of their lives, but it was work they would do together, supported by the unshakable foundation of love and purpose that their grandmother had given them. In the end, the vigil had been about more than saying goodbye. It had been about promising to remember, to continue to honor not just through ceremony and ritual, but through the daily choices that would shape their own lives and the lives of those they would serve. The Queen's grandchildren had stood guard over her coffin, but she would continue to stand guard over them, a constant presence in their hearts and minds, a source of strength and wisdom for all the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. The silence in Westminster Hall would soon be broken. The crowds would disperse. The cameras would be turned off. But the bonds forged in those 15 minutes of shared vigil would endure, connecting the grandchildren not just to their grandmother's memory, but to each other and to the countless people whose lives have been touched by her extraordinary example of service, duty, and love.